Welcome to the Playwell podcast. Today we're talking to Dr. Alistair Bryce-Clegg MBE, an award-winning early years author, trainer, product designer and lifelong advocate for play. And we're going to be talking about imaginative play and development in the early years. Hi Alistair, thank you so much for joining us. So would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Gladly. So my name is Alistair Bryce-Clegg and I'm now an early years consultant and author, but I started my life as the child of a teacher. And by that you'll know if you are the child of a teacher or you're a teacher with children or an early years worker, to be fair, with children, you've cursed them from the minute they came out, because for my mum, everything was an educational possibility. So we didn't do anything dull like everybody else. We just did educational things and we slept in tents so that was my kind of early life. So I always had an involvement in education and teaching. And then I qualified as a teacher, didn't want to work with early years children. That was actually the last place I wanted to work. I had done some work experience in a primary school in year 5, 6, and I loved it. I'd been down to the early years once and it was a really unfortunate visit that I didn't enjoy. So I just decided I wasn't going to do that again. But then I got, which happens to a lot of us, an inspirational teacher on placement. And she was just magical. And she was a reception teacher and really liked her, but just loved her practice. And she began my now 35-year journey into the importance of getting it right in the early years and how that builds on to everything that comes later. So became a practitioner, worked in multiple settings in multiple schools, then became a deputy head, then eventually a head of a 3 form-entry infant school in Cheshire, and stayed there for 10 years. And then 15 years ago now left and started ABC Does, which is an education consultancy business. And through that, I now have the amazing job, which I love, and I'm fortunate for that I get to travel all over the world, as well as all over the UK, working with early years practitioners, just spending all of my time thinking and doing around early years stuff and working with children, which is just a joy, because no matter how flat you are, there is never a dull day when you're with a group of early years children. I mean, they may be mercilessly rude, but they're always funny.
I actually come from an early years background as well. So I have always been early years, but lots of memories of little children cheering me up for various reasons, albeit it's never that great for your ego. One little girl told me my mum had forgotten to brush my hair that morning and tried to fix it with a Lego brick. So it's always entertaining. Can you tell us a little bit about a play memory for you, Alistair, when you were little? I know you talked about your mum as a teacher. Is there anything that jumps out at you that you remember yourself from when you were wee?
We had loads of opportunities to play, but my mum, as amazing as she was, and I had a really, really happy childhood, but she was a Key Stage 2 teacher. And also I was born and brought up in a very small mining village in the northeast of England where everybody knew everybody else's inside leg measurement. And so it was really important to my mum that when my brother and I, who's 2 years older than me, started school, we were readers and writers, because she felt that that was a real giving your children the best start in life. So I have kind of 2 really strong play memories. I have lots of memories of being allowed out. And again, we're in a small village, quite rural. And it's like that classic thing of your parents would let you go out and you would go and find your mates and you would play. And we used to play around the back of the funeral service, glamorous. We always used to play around the dairy, which was an operational dairy, but we would play on all the stuff that you shouldn't climb on roofs, all that kind of stuff. But there was also lots of green space. So allotments, greens, wooded bits. I have lots of memories of having really good play with my mates there. But I also have memories of my dad had a car and he went to work in it. But my mum and the boys would travel everywhere on the bus. And she would use bus time as learning time. So I remember being kind of wedged into the window seat and her saying, in the way that we do to children, "Would you like to play a game? Would you like to play a game?" And you're like, "Oh, go on then." And it would be basically Janet and John flashcards for an hour. And she'd be like, "What does that one say? Read this for me. What does that one say?" And I have a real strong memory of probably being 3, 4 years old and hating it. And then worrying that when she said, "Do you want to play a game?" having a little knot in my stomach. My brother, on the other hand, loved it, was fluent reader and writer by the time he went to school. He just relished that. And so for him, very different set of circumstances. But when I talk to practitioners now, about what we do in early years and how children who are developing that ability to self-regulate and developing their emotions attach really strong emotions to people, places, objects, resources. And I would know if my mum got that bag out on the bus, rather than thinking, yes, I would literally get that knot and think, I just don't want to do this. So I can remember crying on the bus and my mum saying, for goodness sake, you know, we're only learning words so you can read when you go to school. But actually, it's a really strong, vivid memory. So I think, I mean, for me, there are two that really stand out. But I think we also unwittingly sometimes as practitioners do that in our settings because there's a lot of pressure to teach a lot of the formal stuff. But we can't underestimate how strong children's emotional attachment is in terms of dictating their ability to even to be learners within a space, never mind actually learn something.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting topic, and I appreciate you sharing that, because we're going to come on to talk a little bit more in depth about that, and the way that Penny Lester, who's our engagement participation events officer, had initially kind of read that article. She loves cats. The article had caught her eye, but as she read it, she'd kind of got in touch to say, this is fantastic. And it really brings to life something that most people that have been around children, whether in a professional capacity or personal capacity, would recognise that imaginative play, but wouldn't necessarily understand what's happening there, what actually means for a child. So I think that was the sort of introduction for us, and I've now looked at a lot of your stuff, and it's really, really interesting the way you put it across, because it really helps support that understanding. And if you have that understanding of what's going on, you can tailor what you're doing, because you'd referenced your brother loving it as a game, and children will always be individuals. They'll always be themselves. They'll always react to certain things. There's so many things that have impacted that child that you will never get one child that's the same as the other. And if practitioners can understand what's going on, then they're able to tailor it to make it a really positive experience for every child. So just to come back to that article about pretend play, specifically children pretending to be cats or other animals, how common is this type of play? And when do you think children typically start it, or what kind of age range do we tend to see that?
So common, and any practitioner or parent you talk to will talk about it, because it's not only common, it's really annoying. Because when you've got, especially if I can remember being a reception teacher and having multiple children playing cats in the home corner. So you might have like 6 or 7 children who just crawl around for hours, just meow, 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 meow. And it's literally like, get up, shush. And of course, for very early in my career, I would have been like, what are we doing? Get up. We're not being cats, or that's really annoying, or blah, blah, blah. And so it's like anything with early years. Sometimes you don't, or teaching in general, you don't often get the chance to kind of take a breath and reflect and think, well, actually, if I am seeing this again and again, and especially if you've been in for as long as I have, it's like again and again and again and again and again, there's got to be something in it, different cohorts, different children. And again, I can tell you all over the world, everywhere I've been in the world, there are children who are pretending to be primarily cats or dogs, but sometimes other animals. It usually starts around about 2 and lasts well into being 5. And it just depends. And what's joyous about early child development is it's nuanced. So it becomes comfortable and familiar play. So the reason why a 5-year-old might be pretending to be a cat might be very different from the reason a 2-year-old is pretending to be a cat. If I'm 5, it might be because I enjoy this play because it's familiar and it's comfortable and it's collaborative, and I've done it lots of times, so I know what I'm doing. If I'm 2 or 3, and it often really peaks around about 3 years old, it's about children using the persona of the animal, which is a very familiar thing to them. So even if they don't own a cat or a dog, they'll be very aware of what cats and dogs are. They're in loads of stories. You see them on the television. Other people have got pets. So what they're basically doing is trying to gain a bit of autonomy in their life, a bit of control. And also, it's a time when they're testing everything. So we know that things like impulse control, when you're 2, 3, 4, 5, are not fully developed. Those frontal lobes that manage all of our things like empathy, impulse control, self-regulation, they don't fully develop. Some research says until you're around about 25 years old. Other more recent researchers even suggest it might be into your 30s before you are fully developed. So you've got children who are having big life experiences and coming across things that are constantly new. So as adults, we come across things that are new, but most of our world is very familiar. When you're 2, almost every day outside the basic routine is something new or somebody new. So there's lots going on. And they haven't got always the ability to manage those impulses. Or if you think about any child, really, especially in early years, you're told, or often you're woken up, and it's one of those annoying children like mine where they got up at 10 to 5 every morning for about 4 years and nearly killed me. So you're told when to get up, what to eat, what to wear, when to get in the car, when to get out of the car. When you go into your setting, you're told to come in, sit down, sit in a particular way, listen to an adult, go and do an activity. There's very little autonomy and control in a child's life. And when they want to test out some of those being human emotions, they can do that really safely by being a cat. So, for example, a cat, if I'm pretending to be a cat and you're talking to me and I just crawl away as a cat and completely ignore you, if it was a child standing in front of you and you were talking to them and they just turned around and walked away, you'd be saying, excuse me, I was talking. So come back. But as a cat, I'm like, meow, off I go. And of course, they want to encourage the adult to play. As a cat, I can climb up onto a table. So not only is that taking a bit of risk in terms of climbing, I'm also taking a bit of risk in terms of pushing the boundaries of our adult-child interaction. As a cat, I can have a fight where I've got my claws out and I'm hissing at you. But again, as a child, if a child walked up to you and was like, you'd be like, hang on, what's going on here? So also, we know that in terms of things like cat play, this type of cat that children choose to represent, or dog or animal, is often indicative of what they are feeling emotionally and what they want to explore. So a cat that wants to curl up on your knee and be cuddled and stroked and nuzzle in is often a child who's just leaning into, I just feel a need of a bit of nurture. But then you might get a child who is struggling to cope with whatever because they can't process, and that's coming out in a very physical way, which often happens with children, which is why we get things like meltdowns and tantrums and all that kind of stuff. It's about a physical processing of an emotion. So they might come back with an angry cat, but the angry cat is really just about them finding an outlet to let that emotion that is building up within them that they can't process or articulate out in a particular way. But equally, as we know with the children that we work with, if you're 2, that could also be by sinking your teeth into another child. It could also be by chucking a block across the room. It could also be, if you're older, by tipping resources onto the floor. So it's all different ways of children finding outlets to rehearse being human. But rather than try and take it on yourself and say, this is me, if you can do it through an animal that you can also get the compliance of an adult to engage with that play, it means it feels really safe, but it also feels one step removed from who you actually are. And that adds another whole layer of safeness.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point there that you've touched on, because particularly over recent times, we do talk a lot in the early years about risk analysis and what that looks like for children, and that we give them these physical experiences that will support them to assess their own risk, to push the boundaries of their physicality, to learn what they can do, and to develop their gross motive skills and develop their confidence. We potentially don't have as many conversations about that emotional risk and what that could mean and what that looks like. And I think there's a little bit around, you touched on it there, if children are being big cats or little kittens, or what that can actually mean for what's going on in their inner world at the moment and how they process those feelings, because those are massive feelings. If you've got a 2-year-old that's coming into the world by themselves to that point, if they've had a positive attachment, they're then kind of going in sometimes a bigger setting. They're realising that they can say no to things, that they're pushing their boundaries. There's a huge amount going on in that little world, and given that safe space to explore it. So what does that mean for the adult that's in that environment then, whether that's a parent or a practitioner? How best can they engage with that? What kind of environment would we want to set up to encourage that?
Ultimately, you just want to engage. So when you see this kind of play happening, it's not about saying, stop it, get up, stop being cats. It's about recognising that I understand this is a common stage in children's development. And then what I want to do is look at it through a different lens and think, well, rather than think, oh, they're playing cats, does me head in, you look at it and think, and what sort of cat play are they playing? What am I seeing? Somebody messaged me after I'd written that article and said, what's really interesting is my child asks me to be the cat and they are my owner. What do we make of that? And I was like, that's such, again, a really good kind of articulation of development. If a child who's always not in control, because, when you were 3, you can't be in control of your entire life. I mean, it would be a good television program, put 3-year-olds in charge of the world. Probably couldn't do a worse job than what we're currently doing as adults. But if the child is saying to you, you're the cat, I'm going to feed you. Oh, you bad cat. No, you're not allowed any food. It's about the adult being complicit. What we also know about attachment theory is that children will only do this kind of play with people they feel securely attached to, because there's risk for them in this sort of play that it might go wrong. If a child is then saying to an adult, you be the cat, they are then taking ultimate control in a fantasy situation. So again, they're not saying to the adult in a real parent-child situation, right, you do this, you do that, because again, the response they would likely get is a negative one. But if they say, you're my cat, oh, you're a naughty cat, go over there and get in your basket, naughty cat, you're not having any tea, and you plod off, meow, 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 I'm a sad cat now, into your basket. Yes, it's imaginative play, yes, you're scaffolding around that, but ultimately, that child is having an opportunity to be in control, but in a invented role play situation. So all of the realness is removed and all the risk is removed. It becomes very safe, but yet good for them to rehearse. So when we're talking about things like role play, particularly in small world play, and I do talk about this a lot in my work, what we've got to think about in all aspects of early years development is we want children to flourish in those spaces. So if I'm working with practitioners and we're thinking about creating effective learning spaces, one of my first questions will be, what do you want them to learn? So if you're creating a role play space, what is it that we think role play is really good for our 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds? And when we've kind of talked about the importance of role play, the different sort of skills we can develop, the social interaction, the language development, it's rich and there's lots of them. You then look at the space and say, okay, this lovely list that we've got of these amazing opportunities for development we've got is brilliant. I get that it's currently spring and you've decided that you're going to put a garden centre in your role play area. So my next question is, looking at that amazing list and looking at a garden centre, how many opportunities are there for children to visit these skills in that scenario? Which is usually followed by the question of how many of your children are really familiar with what happens in a garden centre? How many of them live and work in a garden centre? How many even go to a garden centre every single day? And if the answer to that question is none, then it's not really a very effective role play. Because what we end up doing is saying, all of these skills, all of this opportunity, especially with adult modelling, could be even greater. But even when I'm not working with you, I'm going to take your developing brain and your developing knowledge of the world. I'm going to put you in a garden centre because it's themes around what we're talking about at the moment. But I'm expecting you to have so much knowledge of what takes place in a garden centre that you can explore language, storytelling, social interaction, which is why garden centre play often, and Chinese restaurant play and vet play and lots of other sorts of very themed play, usually end up being, I'm the mummy, you're the daddy, you're the naughty baby, cats, dogs, I'm making the tea in the garden centre, or pew, 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 and you're shouting over, they are gladioli, not lightsabers, put them down. Or, so it tends to be domestic play or superhero weapon play. It's what I see most and very themed. When an adult is in the garden centre, and they are scaffolding. I mean, with Garden Centre, we'd have a good discussion about how relevant that was anyway to children's development, but that's a whole other thing. If an adult can scaffold in role play and give language and create scenarios and tell stories, that's great. That's adults doing what adults do best. What we've always got to consider, though, in a good play space, whether it's role play or anything else, is when you step out, which will be a lot of the time, and children step in, Are you enabling them to develop by putting them in a garden centre or a post office or a Chinese restaurant? Or are you actually disabling their development because they can't access the resourcing? So you're almost pushing them down a route of going back to basic play. And that's why you see lots of domestic role play and kind of superhero wrestling play, because they just go back to what they've always done, the most basic. So when we can create areas of provision, role play and otherwise, that are a little bit more ambiguous, that have got some elements of them that children can connect to. I recognize what that is. I recognize what that is. But lots of elements that can be interpreted. It means that different children can tell a different story using the space, rather than all of the children being unable to tell any story because they don't live and work in a garden centre.
Yeah, that's really interesting to consider. And I think from what people have told us, and certainly from my experience in the early years, a lot of practitioners get concerned that they're not providing enough of a variety of activities, that there would be regulators coming in and they would say, well, the home corner's been there for months. And there's a little bit around where our culture at the moment, because we've got digital play and even children are so used to having things be very instant, and adults as well, that we sometimes don't explore the full depth of something. So we will maybe see practitioners changing what something is to go with the season, or they've observed a child and they change it, whereas actually there's a lot of variety within the one can open-ended imaginative PlayStation. And the same if with obviously Lost Parts is something else that is very popular, but when you add some sort of variable shapes and things that can become something else, then that can develop that whole station without making it an entirely different thing. And I think that's where practitioners get a wee bit nervous, that they feel they've got to have this constant turnaround of interesting activities, when actually children have a phenomenal ability to develop things by themselves if they're in a safe and secure space, and they've just got the time and the space and the tools to create it by themselves.
Yeah, and I think there's also a lot of pressure. I was talking about this just this week in social media. Often the accounts that you might follow on Facebook or Instagram, they're all about things that look really pretty and snazzy and are typical of the season, and things move all the time. And so we feel as a practitioner, you have that pressure that everybody else is doing it, and it looks good. But you are completely right. I mean, in terms of things like small world and role play, but we know that if we talk very broadly in terms of dramatic development for that particular area of provision, we know that children kind of develop over 4 main stages. I mean, there are subtleties within those, but children always start with familiar domestic role play. So it always starts with home, because everybody's got a version of home. So role play areas that are home corners can be brilliant for establishing children together. They're familiar. They don't take a lot of imagination or thought. It's just about playing what you know, and it's a collaborative space. But some research was done quite some years ago now, where they looked at the role play of 3-year-olds in a home corner, and they looked at the language, the characters, the story arcs, or what was happening, who was coming and doing what. And the main thrust on all of it was a kind of familiar domestic setup. So there'd be some kind of adults in charge. So it could be either single parent, mum, dad, dad, or some combination granny. They're like an adult in post. And then there was often a naughty baby that added a bit of dimension, but they were mainly carrying out a domestic task like making the tea or making the lunch. And so what they found was that of all the children who played in the space, the story, the characters, and the language was very, very similar and very, very narrow. But these children were 3, so that was to be expected. They then went and looked at role play home corner for 3rd term reception, so P1, 5-year-olds or 4-year-olds, about to be 5, and they were expecting to see something significantly different. And what they saw was exactly the same, that those children who were 4 about to be 5 weren't in their home corner saying, well, there's a mysterious stranger approaching our home corner with a package. I wonder what might be in there. And they were just literally going, I'm the mum, you're the dad. Where's the naughty baby? Meow, meow, I'm a cat, I'm making the tea. So that tells us a very interesting thing as early as practitioners, and that is that resources for children in the early years invite a response. So if you constantly give children resources that they're unfamiliar with, you'll get an unfamiliar response. And if you constantly give children resources that are very, very familiar and have a role, a task, like a kitchen tells you what they're going to do, that will encourage them to give you a very familiar response. So the sweet spot, which is what you were talking about, is when you've got a good level of ambiguity in your space. So you've got objects and resources that can have purpose. So even down to things like a box can be a box or a car or a hat or a microwave or a bomb or a shoe or a dog or earphones or a bath for a hamster. It can be anything you want it to be, depending on where your level of imagination is. So when we create early years spaces that have some obvious resources that children can anchor onto, but a lot of more ambiguous resources that can be open to interpretation and manipulation and reuse, that's where your sweet spot sits, that you don't have to be constantly reinventing and redressing your space. So lots of spaces I will work in, when they talk about their areas of provision, some will say, every week I have to plan something different for every single area. It takes me forever, costs me a fortune. But some of the best spaces I work in, they don't plan something different for every single area, because the area itself is full of resources that continue the learning even when the adult's not there, because they are open enough to interpretation that children could do exactly what you said, and they are brilliant at it. They will use those resources. And then you get the wonderful thing of peer tutoring, where different children see different children use resources in different ways. See, that doesn't happen. When we all say, and again, you can tell when this is going to be recorded because it's very spring and I'm seeing a lot of daffodils out there. And I was in a setting last week where they were making daffodil cards by using a cupcake case, some pre-cut petals and a stripe of green paint to make a daffodil. And the adult who was making them with the children was just gorgeous. But every single child in their creative area, and didn't miss the irony of it being called the creative space, they all made an identical daffodil card, and the adult kindly was helping their hand to stick the things in the right place so the daffodils look like daffodils. But again, all that does, and it's often tradition and how we've been taught to do things in early years, but that actually stops children's brain development. So we know when you give children a collection of resources and maybe some scaffolding, and you teach them skills, and you say, right, what could we do with these? They've got to use their brains to think about, well, that might fit on that, or you could do that, or that looks a bit like that. Oh, I haven't seen that before. And so therefore we're building those synapses, we're kind of building that brain. When we're saying to children, we're all going to make one of these, it's going to look like this is what you're going to make it with, and here's one I made earlier, it actually stops any of that brain action from happening. And we know it conditions children to a point where if it happens all the time, they begin to just wait for an adult to present them with a task that they're going to do. So spaces that are more open-ended, spaces that are more ambiguous, whether that be role play, small world, or anywhere else, are the ones that actually have the biggest impact on developing creative and critical thinking, which is what ideally we want for children, not only in the early years, but as they move further through school.
I'd mentioned earlier about that imaginative play effectively gives children the permission to be brave. And I think there's a little bit in that for practitioners as well. And I know there was for me in the past that it can be a really scary thing to do, because you're going out on a bit of a limb. You're trusting children to develop it in a way that works with all your professional commitments as well, because we know that we know that the sector has struggled up in Scotland for a long time with 11 and 1140 and the numbers, and it is an amazing job and it's an amazing way to spend your life, but at the same time it is difficult, and I don't think anybody would deny that. And there's that common phrase about never work with children or animals, and we're almost talking about a scenario where you're working with children pretending to be animals. And then trying to link that to, if it's a curriculum-driven setting, you're being asked to link that to learning outcomes. And we obviously know from all the research and the science that is absolutely the case, but we do need people that are willing to sort of step up and almost do what they know and be comfortable in what they're doing. Because a lot of older practitioners have certainly told us, my mum was a nursery nurse, and I know you said your mum was a teacher, but when I first started going to uni to learn about child development and how it worked, I've always sort of repeated this story that I learned about how the brain worked, and I came home quite excited to talk about if the brain's in fight or flight mode and a child will struggle to learn and they need that. And she said, did you go to uni to find out that if a child's hungry or tired, they won't be able to learn properly? Well, yeah, sort of. So there's that little bit of, we've got a lot of practitioners that know from experience how children engage, but then they start to sort of doubt themselves because we use a lot of language around something that is actually very natural when we're brave enough to sort of step back. And that can be a really hard thing to do. But we also would know how important this play is for children. And I think we talked about how wonderful it can be, but can we just chat a little bit about what the potential consequences are, what this means for a child to explore their feelings? You'd said you'd moved into the early years on that understanding that that's actually the foundation that builds everything as the child grows. So are you able to just touch on a little bit about what not having these experiences can mean for a child as they grow and even right into adulthood?
We do know that early years curriculums across the world are different from the curriculums that come later, that are more subject-based, that are more knowledge-based, and that early years curriculums are based around play. And there's a reason for that, and it's not just personal preference. It's about how we know that little humans physically and biologically develop into big humans in the best way possible. So if we simplify it down, and it is really simplifying it down, we know that children develop physically, cognitively and emotionally. So you've got the physical space that you can inhabit with how you use your body. You've got your cognitive development, which is how you learn to speak, how you learn the things that you know, eventually you learn to read and write, all that kind of thing. And then you've got that physical movement. Now, these things are the three main thrusts as children develop. But the annoying thing for practitioners is they don't all develop at the same rate. So you can have children who are very physically forward in their development, but very physically far back in their emotional development. And the one that is least often featured in curriculum, and certainly in kind of setting practice due to top-down pressure mainly, but the one that is the most important is the emotional development, because that controls everything. So we often talk about children being physically safe in the spaces that we create, and we look at safeguarding, which is really important, and we make sure that our children are safe. But also I talk a lot about children being emotionally safe. So I will ask practitioners, can you talk to me about how you create an environment that has emotional safety for these children? And that emotional safety just means exactly that when a child walks through the door, they're not getting a knot in the pit of their stomach. So talking in England to some reception teachers a couple of weeks ago who were giving, they were gorgeous people working really hard, but every morning they started by saying, come on everybody, find your name card, sit down and write your name, trace your name. So first job of the day, trace your name. And they delivered it like somebody had just won a trip to Disney. But when you stand and watch things like that, and lots of us do it, it's very traditional practice, what you basically see is the children who can write their names, write them, no issue, but they haven't had any impact on their learning particularly. The children who can't write their names, and there were still some children who were palmar supinate grasping like this, and they were given a tiny little slip of paper like this, which is covered in dots, and some of them were turning the paper on its side, upside down, just not doodling, not doing it at all. And then, of course, they finish and then they move to the carpet to sit still. But for those children, it's like saying, let's start every single day of your working life by you going to work and doing a job that you hate and that you're not very good at. And just by doing that job, sadly, you're not going to get any better at it, because nobody's going to sit down with you and give you a strategy for supporting you to be better. They're just going to say, keep doing what you're doing, but keep doing it every day in the hope you get better. So emotional safety comes from us often as practitioners questioning what we do and why we do it. I was reading some research really recently, and I've just written about this, which is about the fact that children who shout out can't help it. So the research basically says, and I'm paraphrasing, that as part of our development, impulse control in those frontal lobes develops really slowly, and for some children a lot slower than others. But shouting out is a perfectly normal part of child development. But yet, if you're in a setting and a child shouts out, 9 times out of 10, the adult in that space will chastise that child from shouting out, or will say something like, we don't shout out here. What do we do if we've got something to say? And the problem is, as the research tells us, that a child who's at that stage of their development can't reason oh, well, I had that thought, but actually my frontal lobes are well enough developed for me to have some impulse control and retain that thought. And also, if you think about, if you've got a thought in your head that's exciting, and then you don't shout out because of agreed setting rules that have been agreed by an adult that you don't quite understand, the process of having the thought, repressing the thought, thinking about when's the right time to have the thought, thinking about the action that you have to do while you're waiting for the adult to choose you, having to suffer what's called delayed gratification in the fact that you want it now, but you can't, but you're only 3 or 4 or 5, and it's really hard to keep a handle on that. And also that children shout out for one of 2 reasons usually. One, because they get it. You're saying something that they just get and they have this kind of, I know about that, so out it comes. Or they have disengaged. So if you're lucky, they'll do kind of lights on but no one's home, so you'll find them sitting like Stepford children, but they are having an internal dialogue that's not what you're talking about, which is why when you're talking about the properties of a triangle, somebody will say, I had chicken nuggets for my tea, just out of the blue. Or the worst is where they'll say things like, my hamster is dead in the middle of your shape session. And then you've got 2 choices. You either say, well, we're not talking about dead hamsters now, which is not great. Or you show sympathy and say, oh, that's really sad, Harry. Are you feeling sad about your hamster? I bet you are. Shall we talk about that later? But thank you for sharing that with me. But then you know what's going to happen is you'll have what we call in early years a dead off, where lots of little hands will go up then. And lots of children will be saying, my hamster, my dog is dead, my grandma is dead. And then suddenly you're in this kind of death sphere where, so what the research was basically saying was, when children shout out, which is perfectly normal, what adults do is chastise them, even if they do it nicely. And that in a developing brain turns into public shaming. And that's when, as you were talking about, the fight or flight kicks in. When a child shouts out something, whether it's the right answer or not, it's a triangle. And you say, hang on, what do we do when we want something to do? Put up our hand. They then go into a state of shame. It's a state of being called out in front of it, just like you would in a staff meeting. If you said something and somebody said, pardon, got a comment, like to share, or not for now. And so what they're not then doing is processing, why did that go wrong? How can I make it better? They're just thinking, I'm feeling this real sense of being called out for actually saying the right answer. And children aren't repeatedly shouting out because they're trying to make you cross. They repeatedly shout out because they haven't yet developed the skills to be able to suppress that need. And again, like we said before, just saying, don't shout out, doesn't help them. You can't develop that part of your brain overnight by an adult saying, or over a week or over a month, by an adult saying, don't shout out, put your hand up, don't shout out, put your hand up, which is why we say it all the time to the same children. But when they are 6 or when they're 17, they're not, it's at college with somebody saying, don't shout out, put your hand up, because by that point, you've matured, you've learned it. So we know that what we should be doing, if that's happening, is rather than blaming the child, then trying to think about what could we do differently in this space that would enable them to be able to do what they need to do and not put them in that position. A long time ago, somebody said to me, when we talked about behavior and behavior management, so this is when I was a practitioner, so a long time ago, and they said, rather than looking at it like poor behavior, Alistair, try and think about it as a need unmet. So if a child wriggles on the carpet, if a child shouts out, if a child refuses, if a child throws sand, if a child pulls somebody else's hair, if a child bites, whatever it may be, rather than saying we don't do that here, think about it as what in this scenario is not in place to support that child in terms of what they need, or what is that behavior telling you about what they need, as opposed to just saying, we don't do that here. Which is why lots of mechanisms in early years, like having pegs that you move, or going onto the red traffic light, or having your name written on the board, they are really ineffective behavior management strategies for children in the early stages of development, because they don't understand the process. They can't reflect and think, what went wrong? How do I put it right? They just feel shame. And that then doesn't enable them to get better. It means they begin to attach those very strong emotions with you, with this space, with this carpet, all of those things. I remember once, I'll tell you very briefly, working with a little boy we were working together in a sandpit, and it was really interesting. And the adult in the space, was nursery, said, "Everybody stop where you are, because I've got and then she ducked down and she popped up and she had a beautiful bag, all sequins. It was gorgeous. And she said, "I've got my sparkly bag." And she said it like that, as you would, "My sparkly bag." And the little boy I was working with went, "Oh." And I said to him, "What's in the bag?" And he went, "We're going to sing." And I said, "How do you know?" He said, "We always sing when you get the sparkly bag out." And I said, "Do you not like singing?" "I hate singing." So just an adult going, "I've got a sparkly bag," was enough for him to completely shut down. So when we went to the carpet, he dragged his feet. He didn't want to be there. He sat in the car. And so that's a lovely example of how somewhere along his history, something's gone very wrong when the sparkly bag came out. So maybe he was massively engaged in play, or maybe he couldn't sit still on the carpet, or maybe he didn't get his turn with the instrument, or maybe the instrument was taken out of his hand because he fiddled with it when he shouldn't been. Something has happened that he then associates a really strong emotion, one that's strong enough for him to go, "Oh," just at the sight of the bag that might have a musical instrument in. So little brains sometimes struggle to process big emotions, but those big emotions have huge impact on how those little brains process the space. And so more and more, to go back to your point, it's about practitioners. And I know this is not always the way that you are taught to do it, or the way that you're asked to do it by people who are making judgments about your practice, but it's to constantly reflect and think, is this the fault of the child, or is it something I can do differently with my space that more authentically reflects child development, and not a kind of convoluted curriculum that we have to use because of top-down pressure. And I get that's easy for me to say and far more difficult to do. But if you've got that in your head as a practitioner, it just means you look with a slightly different lens, which I think really helps you to make those changes in your practice.
It's really interesting, Alistair, and we will need to finish up, but it's so useful to have that reminder that play is this fabulous thing that we can do, and it's so much fun. Children are intrinsically wired to play, but those behavioural patterns that are set in the early years absolutely follow people for the rest of their lives. And it's just that reminder that we've got this phenomenal opportunity to create the kind of environment will set those children up for the rest of their lives. Play really is so important, so incredibly important at that stage.
It is. We are humanly programmed to learn, but also, and we forget this, I think, as adults, we have the opportunity to play or be playful on a daily basis. And not many people get that opportunity, so we should seize it. And if you're listening to this thinking, "Oh, well, actually, I don't feel that in my post or in my work," then it's about also reflecting on that and thinking, you're working with a play-based curriculum. You're working with children who learn best to play. It's the thing that you can spend your day doing. If you're not doing it, then you need to make some changes, because it's good for your soul as well as being good for their education.
Brilliant and absolutely true. Thank you, Alistair. We appreciate you coming to talk to us.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on your favourite app or follow us on social media. And if you'd like to know more about Play Scotland, please visit our website, playscotland.org.